Good afternoon, everybody. It's Dr. Eric Balcavage, and this is the Thyroid Answers Podcast, and we've got a special guest today. Before we introduce our special guest, we have the infamous Dr. Erica Riggleman, my co-host on the podcast. How you doing, Dr. Erica?
I'm doing great.
Wonderful weather in Winchester, Virginia.
Yes, excited to be here.
Fantastic. And we have us from somewhere halfway, 3/4 of the way around the world, Elizma Lambert, right? You
yes,
there?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Eric.
So Elizma is a special guest because she is a chemistry nerd, quite like myself, when it comes to something called organic acid testing. We both are a little nerdy when it comes to this type of testing. So we thought we'd have her on the podcast and talk to us a little bit about organic acid testing and how it can be used by doctors to help you understand what's going on with thyroid physiology and why it might be important for the people to learn a little bit about organic acid testing so that they can maybe request it when they go see somebody, because there's a wealth of knowledge that can be found out when we do organic acid testing. So welcome to the podcast. You're wide awake. What time is it there in Australia?
5 a.m. in the morning.
It's a little late. It's a late start to the day, but we'll let you go.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm a practicing naturopath and homeopath for more than 15 years, where I've been in the health industry. I'm a clinician, so, not just from a research perspective. I see a lot of people with a variety of conditions. And when I look at people or when I treat people, I don't actually look at it from a disease perspective. I look at it from a cellular physiology perspective. So in my opinion, you can call anything by any name. It doesn't really matter as far as I'm concerned. If you can identify what the biochemical issues are from a cellular level, you fix that, then from my perspective, you can fix anything. So it's not looking at disease as a noun, but more as a verb, and figuring out what's going wrong or what's the response in the body and sort of like addressing it as such. And that's why I don't necessarily specialize in anything. I see from preconception to autoimmune disease to, infectious diseases, just everything, because, I take a very generalist kind of approach when I look at people. So, I've been in clinical practice for a very long time, really enjoy it. But I love doing my research on the side as well, because like you said, I'm a little bit of a geek. So I'm constantly looking for the answers and how to get people better, and but I love what I do. I got into the business actually because of my son. I've got two teenage boys. My eldest son, when he was very little, he had some developmental issues, and that was my driving force behind looking at things from a different perspective and not following the medical model, so to speak, because that was all that was there for me at that stage 15 years ago. And so it was my driving force into looking for things beyond what was being offered at that point in time in treatment. So my son was my inspiration in getting to where I am today.
That's awesome. I think that these days so many doctors try to simplify what's going on with patients and only are looking at the symptoms and trying to treat the symptoms and not truly looking at the root cause. And so taking a look at the cellular reason why things are malfunctioning, I think, is really, really important. I know in your clinic and in your research, you utilize organic acid testing. Could you explain to our listeners what an organic acid test truly is?
Yeah, so an organic acid test is it's a urine test. So first of all, it's a very easy test to do with most people because there's no needles involved. It's a simple thing you can do with children as well. But organic acids are pretty much these very acidic compounds that is made in our body from foods that we eat. So from the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that we process through metabolism, you get this formation of these acidic compounds called organic acids, and that's what you dump in the urine. And that's what you measure when you do an organic acid test. And different organic acids will give indications of different organ systems that may be compromised or working too hard or not working as it should, because it has to go through these biochemical processes. So pretty much, a very simple way of explaining organic acid is you have the substrate, it has to go through an enzyme, and that enzyme processes that substrate and it forms an organic acid. So if that enzyme is compromised or it's not working the way it should, it's inhibited or slowed, there's genetic SNPs or anything like that, then either the substrate will not go through the enzyme process and will just get dumped in the urine, or that substrate will get an alternative route to where it gets processed in a different way. And so that's why you can measure organic acids, and you can get a kind of idea of where there are blocks in the biochemistry, why, where it is not going through its normal process, and then you get these alternate metabolites being formed. Or if there's too much of a substrate, you get too much of a certain organic acid. So it can give you really good clues in terms of biochemistry. I think Eric will agree with me here. Dr. Eric will agree that it's a biochemistry paradise if you know what to look for, because you can get a very good insight from the cellular level of which enzymes are functioning well, which ones are not functioning well, which ones are working harder than the others. And then from there on, you can work on backwards and try and figure out what's the reason for the body responding in the way that it is responding.
And I totally agree. And that's why I like the organic acid test. And I thought that would be one of the reasons it would be really good to have you on. We talk on this podcast all the time. And while we focus this podcast on helping people get answers to their thyroid issues, because it's such a prevalent problem, and thyroid hormone plays such a big role in the physiology of the cell, it's really nice to take a look at an organic acid test because it's telling us exactly what we're looking at. How well does cellular function work? And so if we see problems on organic acid testing, then we can see the reasons why we may have problems with cellular function. We may see triggers for what we talk about on the podcast often is the cellular hypothyroidism. When there's stress within the cell, we talk about the cell danger response. That can reduce the transport of thyroid hormone into the cell and reduce the conversion of inactive hormone T4, that prohormone, into an active form, and instead convert it into a reverse T3, which is the inactive form. So the organic acid test is awesome. Maybe you did a great job explaining that. Maybe even for people who are maybe not quite sure when we're talking about the substances, essentially when we eat food, right? Food goes into the system and we break that food down and digest it, and we absorb different chemicals into our body, different amino acids and proteins, and those things become the substances that are in the body. And then we see what happens to those things as they go through all the different chemical reactions in the body. And what Elizma was talking about is that there's these enzymes that take product A and convert it to product B, and then product B to product C, and product C to product D. And we know that the product E should show up in the urine and smaller amounts of the A, B, C, and D. But if we see larger amounts of those things show up in the urine, then we know we've got a problem somewhere in enzyme reactions breaking down. And so it may be enzyme deficiencies, it could be nutrient deficiencies, what we call cofactor deficiencies, but it just gives us a wealth of knowledge, right?
Absolutely.
So
I think doing an organic acid test gives you unlimited abilities to be able to analyze a patient, because you're looking at a cellular biochemical component, and there's so many factors that play onto it. It's not just one marker. You're getting all of these values, and they're very cyclic and all work together. So you really get a full picture of how the body, all these kinetics are really working, and you can find out where one system is kind of blocked or not working the best that it possibly could. And it may be that you find it on the organic acid test, but you run a complete regular metabolic panel and not have seen anything. You really can fine-tune treatments by running this organic acid test.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's my question for you, and you can help explain to the listeners. Why would an organic acid test many times be a better test to run than just a comprehensive metabolic panel? Obviously, I like both, but especially for people who are maybe a little bit healthier, why would a organic acid test maybe be a better test?
Well, because I feel you can start picking up issues before they really become issues with something like an organic acid test. So when you run metabolic panels, when you run antibodies, all of those kinds of things, when we're talking about in terms of context with the thyroid, a lot of those panels will come back normal if it's in the early stages. And you may miss quite a few things because, things like autoimmune disease, it takes years and years and years to develop or to actually measure it on a test, whereas it's already been in the making for 10 years. So autoimmune disease is a classic example of that, where you only start picking it up from a test perspective much, much later, but the process has already started. So something like an organic acid test can already start measuring those early changes, especially when we look at the mitochondrial markers. You can start getting the measurement of those very early stages of potential for autoimmune disease or any other kind of metabolic disorders. Because the very first place where things usually will start to go wrong is within the mitochondria. That's where everything gets regulated, where hormones get regulated, neurotransmitters, ATP is synthesized to make organs function. All your organs, your thyroid, your pancreas, your liver, your kidneys, they all work on ATP. So if that whole process of ATP is not functioning properly, that will have a flow-on effect on any organ function. Doesn't matter which organ we are looking at, and that absolutely includes the thyroid. So you can start measuring things such as the cell danger response within something like an organic acid test very early on, and especially also root causes. We always talk about root causes. When you're seeing metabolic dysfunction, you're not going to necessarily treat the metabolic dysfunction because, as we spoke about it earlier, the body responds in an appropriate way. It always responds in an appropriate way. Our job is not to fix the markers. Our job is not to fix the pathways. Our job is to figure out why is the body responding in that way and removing that cause, and then the body will just adjust itself. All the markers will fall into place. The mitochondria will start working the way it should. But everything is an appropriate response. I think we need to really stop looking at the body as doing something wrong and we have to fix it. We have to identify why it's doing so, and the organic acid test can really give good clues there because it measures. There's quite a few markers on there, such as a lot of the bacterial markers and the yeast markers, that can give you more clues about what could be the root cause that may be involved in the cellular response. And then if you fix those kinds of things, then a lot of times that fixes those secondary issues of thyroid dysfunction. Because that's the way that I look at thyroid. For me, it's a secondary response to something else that's going on in the body. So it's not always about looking at the thyroid and fixing the thyroid. It's like, okay, why is the thyroid slowing down? Why is it speeding up? Let's figure that out and work on that as a more permanent treatment way of treating the condition.
Right. And I think that's beautifully said. I think the problem is just the paradigm of conventional medicine is different from the paradigm in functional medicine for the most part. I think even sometimes in functional medicine, it gets skewed a little bit when we think that the body's making mistakes. As you said, I don't think, and Dr. Erica, I think, would agree with me as well, that the body really doesn't make mistakes. It does what it needs to do to maintain or try and protect the cell. If we look at all the millions of cells in the body, they're all like separate organisms trying to protect themselves and do what's best for them. It may not be best for the whole organism, but the cells are trying to protect themselves. And when there's threat or attack, they are kind of walling themselves off, decreasing cell metabolism in an effort to actually induce their own cleanup response, something called autophagy. And we talked about that, I think, on our last podcast, is that the cells then can start cleaning themselves up. And we don't want to speed up thyroid hormone metabolism within the cell. We want to actually clean the cell up, have it start to try and get rid of whatever's triggering that response. But let's talk a little bit more about the organic acid test. There's a number of markers and that are on that test. And probably for the listeners, we probably want to think about initially from a patient perspective. Their doctor may or may not recommend it, but why don't you tell people what kind of broad categories are on that organic acid test and why it might be really good to have your doctor order an organic acid test, like the major categories that they can see of what problems exist that, when they do an organic acid test.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, there's quite a few few categories that will give sort of like a different perspective on the thyroid if you know what to look for, because there is unfortunately no direct markers for thyroid on the organic acid test. So it's not like it measures T4, T3 or antibodies or anything like that. Like we said, it measures more from a cellular perspective on what could be influencing that thyroid. So you have to think a little bit outside the square when it comes to organic acid testing. It's not going to be as simple as here is the answer and now I just treat it as such from a thyroid perspective. So some of the markers on an organic acid test, I guess one of the first ones that I like to look at is the oxalate markers. And that's the one that you'll find on the Great Plains one. So I probably have to just mention that there are different companies who do organic acid testing, and they all will have slight variations in the markers that they test for. And it really depends on the answers that you're looking for on which company you want to use. I don't think it's necessarily that one is better than the other. It really just depends on what answers you're looking for. So I use the, if I'm allowed to say it, I use the Great Plains one quite often because it has those oxalate markers, which a lot of the other ones do not have. Right. And the reasons why I look for the oxalate markers is because oxalates are, it's a crystalline structure. We often think of oxalates as in terms of kidney stones. That's what we're familiar with. But they like those little glass shards of crystals that can form in the body, but they can form or store anywhere in the body, in any tissues. And the thyroid is one of the big areas where it can store. So I think a lot of thyroid dysfunction can come from these oxalate crystals storing in that thyroid gland. And the reason also is that the oxalates are very, very strong binders to heavy metals. So, looking at cadmium, mercury, lead, all of those heavy metals. So if it's holding on to metals and it's storing in something like the thyroid, that can absolutely be a reason for a lot of thyroid dysfunction and cellular dysfunction, because we all know about the association of mercury and Hashimoto's, and mercury with the TPO, the thyroid peroxidase antibodies, where it can create that deficit in glutathione, which can then have a secondary effect on thyroid function. So for me, the oxalates is a very big one where I look at, because that can actually have a functional or a structural effect on the thyroid, but also that cellular effect as well, where it holds on to, binds to a lot of minerals and binds to a lot of heavy metals. Because when it binds to minerals like iodine, for instance, iodine is a huge mineral that is involved in thyroid health. Selenium is another mineral that's hugely involved in thyroid health. So when you have oxalates and it's binding to a lot of these minerals, you're gonna become mineral deficient, which will have a nutritional or leave the thyroid at a nutritional disadvantage. So there's various ways of how oxalates can play a role in thyroid dysfunction. And so that's probably one of the big areas that I look at in the thyroid or in the organic acid test when it comes to thyroid dysfunction. That's one area. I would also absolutely look at the neurotransmitter section as well, because when we're talking about the stress response, emotional stress, and we're talking about reverse T3 and how T3 can be inactivated into that reverse T3 form, where it becomes ineffective in doing its job in the thyroid. That's usually driven by adrenal dysfunction and by stress response. And so some of the markers in the neurotransmitter section, such as your dopamine markers, the norepinephrine and epinephrine markers, can give you some clues as to what's going on with that person's stress response. Are they running on adrenaline all the time? Have they become adrenally fatigued? Are they already in those stages of adrenal fatigue already? So it can give you some clues as to the adrenal function and how that may be playing a role within the thyroid as well. So that would be another area that I would look at. And then absolutely the organisms, when we're looking at bacterial markers, Clostridium markers, yeast markers, they are often the driver of cytokines and inflammation. And, a lot of thyroid dysfunction comes from cytokine storms. It's these cytokine storms that drives autoimmune, it drives the whole autoimmune pattern often, and also the cell danger response. Because when there's a whole bunch of inflammation going on, the immune system sort of starts losing its regulatory effect sometimes, and in the process of killing off these bugs, they they damage a lot of organs around them as well, and damage normal cells around them. And the thyroid, being such a delicate organ, is one of those little organs that often end up in the firestorm, so to speak, when it comes to fighting off infections and things like that. So that would be another area that I would look at, and that comes closer to root cause kind of issues. If there's chronic infections going on, the thyroid is just going to be one organ that's going to be affected. And that's what you can measure in your blood testing. But that's not going to be, it's not like the body chooses, well, I'm going to create antibodies to this organ today. It doesn't. It's, when it creates antibodies to the thyroid and we can measure it, you can bet that it's happening in other organ systems as well. We're just not measuring it, so you have to look at it from a global point of view, in that if there's an autoimmune response or a cell danger response happening, it's happening everywhere. It's just that the thyroid is one of the easier areas, or the first areas that you can measure, and you can start noticing changes there because it's so involved in cellular metabolism and ATP production, which you would agree, Dr. Eric, that's where things get slowed down when we are looking at the cell danger response, as the body's trying to go into like a protective mechanism, trying to protect the cells around it from oxidative stress, etc.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that a little bit more. So if we look at that organic acid test, what we're looking at is not necessarily markers of thyroid dysfunction, but we're looking at a lot of times indicators of why thyroid physiology may be changed. And we want to kind of contextualize this in that when we're talking about hypothyroid symptomatology, we talk about that starts at the cellular level. So we're looking at things that may trigger the cellular response to downregulate cell transport and conversion. So TSH is maybe still normal, T4 is still normal, but I have hypothyroid symptoms. So if we look at that organic acid testing, we may see markers of malabsorption. So if there's markers of malabsorption, that means there's maybe some stuff that's going on in the gut and the GI tract where they're maybe not getting the nutrients, right? We may
Absolutely.
We could see markers of yeast and bacterial dysbiosis, as you mentioned. So yeast and bacterial infections, whether they're systemic or gut-oriented, could still impact thyroid function at the glandular level and at the cellular level, because infections that become systemic can trigger that cell danger response. But cell infections that are in the GI tract can also get into the lymph very easily, and there's a direct connection between the lymph and the GI tract and the lymph system and the thyroid tissue. So infections have an easy route of entry into the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is unique in that it doesn't need an immune response to mount its own autoimmune attack. It can do that on its own without the response of the immune system. And you said the neurotransmitter physiology, we can take a look at that, because neurotransmitters may give us a clue that the person's under some form of chronic stress response. We can find out, we can look at that and see, okay, this is a good reason why they may be depressed. And you probably will agree with this, that just because they have depression or depressive symptoms isn't necessarily an abnormal thing. That's actually a healthy thing as part of a stress or sickness response, right? So we don't necessarily want to load them up with a bunch of serotonin, because if we do that, the body's trying to get rid of it to begin with, right? It's trying to create this sick response. And so if we load them up with serotonin, what typically happens then is inhibition of your clearance of your catecholamine. So now they wind up with anxiousness and anxiety because we've now suppressed their ability to get rid of it. Other things that I think you mentioned on there, and I'm just summarizing, is there's markers of cell energy production. So that's another reason why it's really important. And there's markers of oxidative stress and detoxification capacity. Now, the oxalates is an interesting thing when it comes to infections. There's a connection between eating a healthy, kind of higher fat diet and yeast infections and oxalates, and how that may tie in with somebody, especially from a thyroid perspective. They've maybe learned that they have a thyroid problem, or they have hypothyroid symptoms, and they decide they're going to go gluten-free or grain-free and maybe go ketogenic, right? And now, all of a sudden, they have more aches and pains. Is there a tie in there with oxalates?
Absolutely. Oxalates is one of the big triggers for symptoms of fibromyalgia, because if you look at these crystals under a microscope, like I mentioned, they're very, very sharp. So when you are mobilizing oxalates, when you are going onto something like a ketogenic diet, or you're going onto lower oxalate foods, and you start mobilizing these oxalate crystals, it creates a lot of inflammation on its way out. As it's being dumped out of the cells or out of the tissues, it will create a lot of inflammation. But now a lot of people, yes, ketogenic diets are huge, and I myself am a big fan. For me, it works really, really well. But as we know, not everything is suitable for everyone, and there can sometimes be cellular reasons why that is not suitable for people, because a ketogenic diet or a high-fat diet can, it taxes the gallbladder quite a bit. To get all those fats emulsified, that's the gallbladder's function. And I don't know about you, Eric, but I'm starting to think that this is a big overlooked area in a lot of diseases, the gallbladder. When we get to the basics of digestion, yes, we have to look at leaky gut and all of that kind of stuff, but I really feel like a lot of the stuff starts from the gallbladder, because the bile acids within the gallbladder are so important in keeping that gut pH the way it should. And the bile acids being so alkaline, destroys a lot of alkaline sensitive organisms. So it plays a huge role already in just keeping the organisms or the microbiome healthy in the gut, to stop gut dysbiosis from happening, which then will prevent leaky gut and everything else as a consequence. So for me, the bile is a huge area. And if you're following ketogenic diets and your bile function is not on board, you may end up with a lot of you may not do so well on a ketogenic diet, and you may not understand why, because everyone's raving about it and everyone's getting so healthy on it. But that is definitely where gallbladder function needs to be looked at, because if you're not emulsifying your fats properly, you're going to have a lot more of the calcium and the other minerals sort of like bound up with the fats. They form these calcium fatty soaps is what we call them. And so oxalates, again, I hate making things a good guy or a bad guy. There's no such thing. Oxalates is just another compound that you get in foods, the same as you get phenolics, the same as you get salicylates. It's not that they're bad. It's when the body doesn't know what to do with it, or abnormal amounts are allowed to build up, that it creates dysfunction. But normally when you eat a meal, you'll have the calcium bound up with the oxalates in the meal, and it'll just get excreted out of the bowel. But when you have gallbladder dysfunction or bile acids, not enough bile acids, and you have now these fats sitting in the gut, they'll start to emulsify with the calcium and the natural minerals in the meal. And that means that there's not enough minerals to bind up to the oxalates within that meal. So now you have a whole bunch of free oxalates. And that is what gets absorbed from the gut into the bloodstream, and then can end up in your cells over a long period of time. You get the storage of oxalate crystals all over the body. And that'll usually also happen when the body is deficient in sulfur nutrients. Sulfur is another huge area of metabolism that we need to look at, and a lot of people have very much dysregulated sulfur metabolism. So if you're not getting enough sulfur foods in your broccoli, your cabbage, all of those healthy sulfur foods, then that's also going to increase the risk of oxalate absorption into the body, because there's an exchange between sulfur and oxalates within the cells and within the gut. And those are kinds of things that we can pick up in the organic acid test, through something like the glutathione markers, the detoxification markers, can give you some idea on sulfur metabolism to some degree. And when you have these oxalates build up because the person is on a ketogenic diet, that can cause a lot of discomfort. It can cause a lot of symptoms of fibromyalgia, through the direct physical effect of it being such a sharp little crystal, but also I think through the fact that it binds up so many minerals, which can then cause more cellular dysfunction, such as within your liver detoxification systems, because phase 2 liver detox needs a lot of minerals to function. It needs iron to function, and then you look at your methylation cycle, and boy, there's plenty of minerals all over the methylation cycle that you need. So it starts to compromise methylation function. And then we know that methylation is needed to make bile acids, phosphatidylcholine, so it has another flow-on effect on bile dysfunction. So it becomes this vicious circle of things just not working the way it should. And a lot of this can just come from faulty gallbladder or dysfunctional gallbladder function.
No, I totally agree. And we've all had the patient that, you put them on a low carb, low sugar, keto type of diet and they tank on it. And, some patients will say, well, I've tried keto and it's not for me. But, running this test, you may have a better idea of what's really going on so that you can pick a diet that's maybe appropriate or fix the underlying mechanism so they can be on more of a ketogenic type of intermittent fasting or even carb cycling type of diet. I know in my office, I like to use the organic acid test to be able to try to fine tune the funnel of really what's going on. You have all those different areas and categories. So let's say dysbiosis markers show up. I know that I'm going to move on to another test that actually can test that a little bit further to try to narrow that down. Or if they're having detox issues, running other tests to be able to fine tune that. I love to use this as kind of a blanket to say, okay, a roadmap of where are we going to really fine tune the treatment for a patient.
I fully agree with you, Dr. Erica, because this is what I call sort of you get this biochemical snapshot of the body with the organic acid test, because you can get so many areas. You get the neurotransmitters in the brain, you get the gut markers, you get the detoxification liver markers, you get the cellular markers, and from there on, yeah, absolutely, you can fine tune your testing. You can do more parasite testing if you think that the gut is playing a bigger role here. You can do more heavy metal testing, whether you're doing urinary testing or hair mineral analysis or whatever you want to do. You can check more into that. You can do your GPL detox screens or any kind of environmental toxin screening as well if you think that that's playing a larger role. But this gives you that starting point. If you don't know where to start, it can give you that starting point as to, okay, where do we need to go and look a little bit deeper when we're looking for root cause or when we're looking for the reasons for the cell danger response. Because you also, you need thyroid hormone, you need T4 to get the fatty acids into the mitochondria, and get that burned up for energy as well. So often, when we look even at the fatty acid markers on the organic acid test, if thyroid function is compromised, if T4 is not on board, you can get a lot of this dumping of fatty acids into the urine as well. So there's a lot of these hidden kind of markers that, if you take it all into consideration, can give you a really clear picture of what's going on with the thyroid. It's not an easy, a lot of practitioners like to get that answer, and unfortunately it's not going to give you that answer. But it's if you have the ability to take the whole test and understand where it fits into the biochemistry, you can get absolutely incredible information when it comes to thyroid dysfunction, if you just know what to look for and which patterns to look for. Because I'd say that most, if not all, of the markers on organic acid test have some relationship with the thyroid one way or another, whether directly or indirectly. So just knowing what to look for.
And I think that's the thing we need to kind of explain to the listeners a little bit is if you're a person who's going to a doctor, especially a functional medicine practitioner, the three of us would agree that organic acid is a foundational test in functional medicine. It's like, in traditional medicine, a blood test is kind of a foundational thing to go get your blood work done. While we use that as well as kind of foundational testing, we think the organic acid test is really a foundational test because it gives us not really necessarily disease states, but function of organ systems. And so if we can take a look at the function of organ systems, we can often, as Dr. Lambert said, you can often see problems occur before they get to that disease state. We can catch those in the dysfunctional state. The challenge with organic testing is you need to find a practitioner who understands the test, and there's different levels of explanation of the test. Dr. Lambert and I both like to teach organic acids, and we both probably agree there's different levels of understanding. When a doctor runs a test, there's the very basic level of understanding and just using the suggestions from maybe from the lab that say, hey, these nutrients may be beneficial. And it's a good way for somebody to get started it usually doesn't work that way.
No.
But if somebody fully understands the organic acid testing, there is so much information there, and it's not really one marker when your doctor looks at a test like this one's high or that one's high. What a good practitioner who understands organic acid testing will do exactly what Dr. Lambert's talking about and Dr. Eric is talking about is they'll take the whole thing into context and say, okay, these markers are a little bit elevated. What's the likely reason for that? And they'll start pulling other pieces of the test together. And you can start to bring all that information together, and you can get a very kind of streamlined treatment plan when you take a look at the whole test versus saying, okay, this is deficient, so this must be vitamin A, and this must be B3, and this must be B2. It's not really that simple and straightforward. So I think a lot of practitioners don't do it because it looks like a lot of work to understand it. But if you find a practitioner like one of the three of us who utilizes those tests, understands the depth and breadth of the test, that doc can get a lot of information out of that test, and that can save a patient thousands of dollars in testing, because you don't need to necessarily run a whole bunch of other tests when you look at an organic acid test, because there's so much you can address and work on just from that panel. Would you agree, either one of you?
Oh yeah, I totally agree.
Absolutely agree. Because you've got a very good point there. If you had to run like a liver detox profile, and you had to run a CSA gut profile, and you have to run all these different tests, it can end up being thousands of dollars. And this is just such a good starting point, because before you get into doing all of that testing, you can first just do a screening test through something like an organic acid test, and then work from there. And I think the more that you do it, and I'm sure both of you will agree with me, the more that you do it, after a while, you don't really need a lot of those other tests anymore, because you start to recognize patterns, and you already know what those other tests are going to show after you've looked at enough of these organic acid tests. So, and then it's just about getting to the root cause treatments, working from the foundations, and then a lot of these markers just fall into place. You made a very good point, Dr. Eric, is that most practitioners will just read the back end of the report with all the nutritional information on there. The first thing I do is throw that away. Really, it's useless. And all you end up doing is your client goes onto a lot of expensive supplementation, and it's not addressing the things that it's supposed to be addressing, because you're supposed to get a lot of those nutrients from your diet anyway. So either you have to change the person's diet, or you have to fix their leaky gut so they can start absorbing these nutrients. It's not just about throwing a whole bunch of nutrients and more supplements. Now, oxalates is a classic example. So you've identified this thyroid dysfunction. You've identified they need more iodine and selenium and other minerals. Giving them more minerals whilst they've got something like oxalates or yeast infections going on becomes a bit of a pointless process, because they're just being bound up. So get rid of the things that's creating the mineral deficiency in the first place, so they can start absorbing their minerals, and so that the thyroid can get the cofactors to start to function properly. So that's how you should be looking at these tests, is looking at from a cellular dysfunction point of view, and not just like, what supplements can I give my client now? And you'll start also anyway with, you may start seeing the same trends with certain nutrients. You start to just know what's going on with this person. You start seeing the same kind of nutrient dysfunction, because there are areas in the biochemistry where these nutrients fall into place. And so just looking at the pattern of nutrient deficiency can also start giving an idea of what's going on and what needs to be treated, apart from just giving the person the supplements. When I treat people, I actually use very, very few supplements. Even if there's a lot of dysfunction, I use very few supplements, because it's starting from the foundational areas. You can get so much change happening already, and a lot of these markers just normalizes by itself once you get the cells out of that cell danger response. So it's not about giving a whole bunch of supplements, vitamins, minerals, and things like that. Just get the basics of the body working again, and a lot of things will just normalize. So, and that comes to truly understanding and truly being able to interpret the test, which, as you've pointed out, there's not a lot of practitioners who feel comfortable doing it, because it's a scary test. You look at the test and there's all these very big names, biochemical names. And I found that even though this test has been around for so many years, practitioners avoided using it, because it's very intimidating when you don't understand the markers. But, people like you, Dr. Eric, and me, when we start educating practitioners and we start to simplify it, it becomes less scary and less intimidating, and they start to know where the markers are applicable, and where it fits within a lot of biochemical cycles, and it becomes a really fun test to do. It's just a really such a wealth of information, and the kind of different patterns that you see with different people. When you're working with athletes, when you're working with really sick people, it's just really, really interesting when you start seeing these different patterns sort of evolving based on people's lifestyle and everything else. So,
right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting about the tests, and one of the mistakes sometimes I see from people who get the test down or practitioners is they'll read and say, okay, B6 looks like this pathway is B6, so I need to give them B6 because that's what it says at the end. But I really caution that from a practitioner standpoint, that the following that advice, because many times B6, B3 isn't necessarily deficient, but under a stress response, the body uses B6 for a specific pathway from a cell protection perspective. We may want B6 to do pathway A because that's what we want to feel better. But the body's saying, hey, I'm not using B6 for that. I'm going to use B6 to do this process because that's
Yes.
something that's more helpful for the cell intelligence, right? And that's what we see sometimes when you read like message board sites or people are saying, my friend took B6 and I can't take because I'm allergic to it. Well, you're not allergic. Your body's doing with B6 what it needs to do. It's not an allergy to B6 many times. And some people say, well, I just need to take more and more and more, and it doesn't work for me. Well, it's not doing what you want it to do, right? The body's pushing pathways that are most effective for individual cellular health. And when there's stress response going on, it's going to use those nutrients the way it needs to use them, not necessarily the way we want to do, so it makes us feel all cushy and make us feel good. And I think that's a mistake that sometimes we make as practitioners, and sometimes we make a mistake as patients or people. We say, hey, if I take B12, this should make me feel good because it made my friend feel good. Maybe not. Maybe it's going to go through a different pathway.
Absolutely. It's when we try to micromanage the body through individual nutrients, and it just doesn't work.
Right.
Doesn't work.
And Dr. Erica and I have talked about this multiple times, that, and I'm sure you've seen it too. One of the first things we often do with patients when they come in is take the 2 bags of supplements that they came in with from all their other practitioners, plus their own self-doctoring, and kind of drop them in the trash, because you don't need 2 bags of supplements to be healthy. And most people think they need all of those. And then the next question is, but how do you feel? Well, I feel terrible. That's why I'm here. Good. Then you don't need all the stuff that's not working.
Yes, absolutely.
But if we look at it,
But they bought it at Costco and it was this big.
Yeah.
Got
a good value. But I mean, and that's nature, right? That's our nature. We want to kind of find the easy answer to do stuff. And if it works, that's great. But I think the unique thing about when we're talking about thyroid physiology, we talk about organic acid testing. From Dr. Erica's standpoint in mind, we're talking about thyroid gland can be functional. You can have normal T4, but something's decreasing the transport and the conversion. And where the organic acid is so good is that giving us reasons to why that stress response would occur. Whether it's an infection, a heavy metal toxicity, whether it's a number of different factors that we can see a stress response because of what's happening with the neurotransmitters. A doctor who knows how to use that test can get a wealth of knowledge, not to treat your thyroid. That's really not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do in our world of functional medicine is get to root causes, as Dr. Lambert was saying, and has said a bunch of times. Got to get to root cause, and this test helps us understand root cause. The blood work's great to know that, hey, we've got a high reverse T3, but we still need to understand why that's occurring. And that's where the organic acid in the hands of a skilled practitioner can really save you a lot of time and a lot of money, and then start working on some of those foundational things like improve the diet. You can start improving the diet. You can work on sleep habits, reduce stress. You can see that there's many areas when we take a look at this test where we can start helping the person without supplements, with just diet and lifestyle habits, to really start reducing the stress response on the cells. And just those simple things, even oftentimes without supplementation, can really start to turn somebody's health around.
Absolutely.
All right. So we've probably got, what else do we got to consider talking to Dr. Lambert about, Erica? I could keep going because I could talk all day about it, but what other questions do you have for specifically?
I mean, we've covered a lot of the organic amino acid testing. I mean, exactly what we utilize it for, how it relates to the thyroid. One question that it's not completely off topic, but I know that you're pretty ingrained with the GAP diet. How do you utilize the GAP diet with your patients who have chronic health problems or even specifically having thyroid issues?
Okay, so yeah, I'm a certified GAPS practitioner. I guess I've relaxed my stance on that quite a bit over the years. I've moved away from extreme diet kind of patterns to more of a moderation approach, because I find that there are so many diets around, whether we're looking at ketogenic, GAPS, paleo, all of those diets, and I think it's becoming a bit of a nutritional problem, in that a lot of people, when they start a lot of these diets, they feel really good in the beginning, and then they're too scared to come off them. And I think in the long run, it can develop into a lot of nutritional deficiencies. So I've become a lot more moderate in my dietary approach with things, and I like to think more from a common sense kind of point of view. So I guess when I'm looking at autoimmune issues and thyroid issues, I like to go on something like what I call an anti-inflammatory diet, or a Mediterranean style diet, or whatever you want to call it. Just basic, good, healthy eating, get lots of vegetables in there, get good amounts of protein in there. But then I incorporate some of the GAPS protocols in there, like I'll get them to do bone broths and things like that to start helping with that healing of the gut. Obviously I'll take them off sugars and simple carbohydrates and things like that to stop feeding organisms that may be fueling that cell danger response. So I do incorporate a lot of those GAPS protocols still in there. There's very, very few people I still put on very strict GAPS, unless they have very, very serious food intolerance or allergy kind of conditions, where they really cannot eat, any foods, and they're already very restrictive in their diet. And I think the GAPS is a great way to start getting that healing process happening, and getting the gut in a better state to absorb nutrients. In those cases, I think it works really well. But I don't just put everyone off the bat on a GAPS protocol, because I think I don't think it's always necessary in most people. I think it's very important to get healthy eating habits ingrained into people. So for that reason, I try and steer away from extreme diets from that perspective. But I like to incorporate some of those principles, whether it's ketogenic principles or GAPS principles, within a diet, depending on what I think is going to be best for that person. But I think we just need to really start looking at diet we just need to start eating again like we were eating 100 years ago or so. It's just getting some good food into us. And I think, in that regard, we need to be careful of not trying to find the answer, just as we're finding answers in supplements, not finding answers in an extreme diet as well, because I think that can have its own issues along the way. But yes, absolutely, still incorporate a lot of bone broths and things like that. There are some times when I will not use something like that, where I'll be a bit more careful, because it is a very high histamine kind of eating pattern as well. So sometimes it's not appropriate. Each person needs to be treated as the individual they are.
I 100% agree with that. And I just like you hit the nail on the head when the patients get so stuck in certain diets that they're in, or even certain practitioners get stuck in everybody has to be this diet and everybody has to follow this protocol. When I think it's more of an encompassing, let's try to find the things that reduce the inflammation. Obviously we know what carbs or even gluten can do to the body, and, reducing them and, just eating good and healthy foods can be really good, but getting stuck at always being in ketosis and never carb cycling, or even one thing that I've been doing a lot of research on that I think is going to be beneficial for a lot of people is to eat in season. I mean, we're eating foods that our bodies, were never designed to eat, in the summer or in the winter, and we're forcing it. And maybe there's an environmental aspect to you being able to digest those foods. And I find that as a very, interesting kind of concept.
Absolutely.
I think you're both right. And I think one of the things that's really important is to keep it simple. If we take a broad look at all the diets that have come across, they all can be successful to some degree, especially in the short run. But there's this kind of nitpicky where we fight about my diet's better than yours. And the reality is that most of the diets that have some success and work long term don't revolve around calorie restriction. They do revolve around reduction of sugars and sugar-based additives. They do revolve around reducing processed foods and especially processed grain foods. So if we keep it simple for people and just say, eat real food, the closest to the way it came out of the water, walked the earth, came off the tree or out of the ground, eat real food in its whole state. If you eat less processed food and just focusing on eating more real food in its natural state, they're naturally going to be lower sugar. They're naturally going to be lower gluten. They're going to naturally be eating a healthier, higher fat diet. It just works that way. So I think when we get into arguments like, should it be, how long should the fast be? And do I need to cycle? And do I have to be in ketosis all the time? The key is, for most people, they're not disciplined enough to do that and be successful long term. So keep it super simple. 85% of the time, eat real food like it came out of the earth and off the water. And maybe 15 or 20% of the time, enjoy yourself a little bit. If you do it in kind of that kind of mode, if it's your birthday, yeah, eat some sugar, enjoy yourself, have a good time, right? Don't think life is going to end, right? If you want a glass of wine because you're out with your friends, great. But if the majority of the time, 80+% of the time, you're eating real food in a whole state and you're cutting back on all the processed sugar and carbohydrates, those people are going to have lower insulin levels. They're going to be healthier. They're going to be able to get into a ketotic state, not have to worry about it because they're going to be healthier. And then when it comes to eating, we can also get away, and I think both you guys will agree with this, is we just got to get away from eating like set meals, like you have to eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner and 2 snacks in between. That's ridiculous. If most people just ate when they were hungry, really hungry, and didn't eat when they weren't hungry, they would probably be in a much better state because they'd go through these periods of natural fasting. We have time. Most of us eat just because it's breakfast. And somebody told us it's the most important meal and you have to eat breakfast. Or it's, oh my gosh, it's 12 o'clock, I have to eat lunch. And they're not even hungry. So just, I try and get my patients to try and keep it really, really simple. You want this anti-inflammatory diet, but what an anti-inflammatory diet is a real food diet, is what both of you guys were mentioning, right? It doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to have a fancy name. If vegetarians married paleo, we'd be perfect, right? But yet we're going to both two groups that are arguing with each other. Which one's better? Well, neither one of them is better by themselves. They're both better in combination because we're arguing over this minuscule thing, and the people that are making processed food love it because we're circling the wagons and shooting each other instead of really going after the real enemy, who are the processed food companies who are just loading everything with sugar. And when they say, okay, it's not sugar, it's maltodextrin, or it's high fructose corn syrup, and we hide it under a whole bunch of different names, that's where the real villain is hiding. It's not whether vegetarian or paleo is better. It's whether sugar and processed carbohydrates are good for us or not. And we would all agree that if you just ate more real food, then you'd probably be better off. But gosh, the food industry's got everybody fooled, right? They just keep moving it. Well, fat was bad. Now this is bad. Now calories are bad. Instead of really what it really was just sugar and processed carbohydrates. There's the villain. Yeah. That's what we have to
Absolutely.
get rid of.
And getting back to moderation, because even within the ketogenic types of communities, I find that there's so many different variants on ketogenic diets, and a lot of them see it as an excuse to just eat as much fat as you want to eat. And it's like, we always seem to be moving to extremes or looking for a reason why we can consume a lot of one type of food. And because we're cutting out a food group here, so now we're eating tons of this. And we're just really losing that whole concept of moderation and common sense eating, which we really need to get back to.
And I think Dr. Erica would agree with this as well. I mean, you see people in the fitness community and even the paleo community who think, well, I'm going to cut out carbs, so I'm going to eat lots of protein. Well, that's not necessarily going to be helpful either. It's still going to drive your insulin levels up if you're over consuming protein. And that can trigger the same cell danger response we're talking about. It can still create blood sugar issues and thyroid issues if they do that. So it's this weird thing that we do. We have to be, I think it's being part of a tribe and I'm this, right? Instead of just saying, I'm just me, I'm paleo. Well, okay. How about you just eat real food and keep it simple? And I know Eric and I have talked about this before. People get panicked about what they're eating and like, I don't like this new diet because I don't know what to eat. What? We're not limiting you. The only thing we're really saying is cut out the sugar, so you can eat anything you want, any quantity you want, as long as it's real food. And people can get really stuck because they're so used to sugar and processed carbohydrates, things that you purchase in the middle of the shopping aisles here in the States. It comes in a bag or a box, and then once they have to go back to a real food and actually cook real food, that's when they get, I think, lost, and they're confused as to, oh my gosh, what do I need to do? Because somebody's prepared simple meals for them, and we've gotten away from just cooking our own healthy food.
Absolutely.
I'm ranting again, but I think we got that one cured. So let's kind of wrap this baby up because we're getting probably to that hour mark. So from a perspective, what we typically want to do is leave some kind of parting remarks for whether it's doctors or actual people that are listening to this and trying to figure out their own health. When somebody comes to you and they've got some health issues, definitely the organic acid test is something do you consider running that on almost every patient or quite a few patients? Where do you see that as your kind of baseline for running that test from a frequency standpoint?
I probably would run it maybe 80% in 80% of clients. I try to be very careful of not, just running everyone on the same test. Every person who comes in gets treated absolutely individually. So it's usually the test that I would run if I think there's quite a few things going on with that person. And I just need to get a better idea of where I need to focus my attention on. Do I need to focus it more on the gut? Do I need to focus it more on things like environmental toxins? Do I need to focus it more on stress responses, like neurotransmitters, etc.? So that's where I really like to run it. But if I already have a very, very good grasp of what I need to do with that person, then I won't run it. I don't like to spend people's money just for the sake of spending people's money. But I'd probably say I'd run it about 80% of the time just to get my focus in the area where I need to have it. Because as you both would agree with me, often time if you don't have any data to work on, if it's a very complex case, you don't have data to work on, you can end up with wasting a lot of money in terms of supplements and time because you're guessing and you're just trying this and then trying that and then trying that. So sometimes it is worthwhile to just run the test and maybe a combination with other tests as well to get your answers, get a clear path or a treatment plan or a way forward, and they get better very quickly instead of trying to stuff around with trying this and then trying that. So and it's actually it's over here one of the really cheaper tests to do compared to a lot of other tests. So I don't really have any issues with people paying to get the test done because they get better so much quicker once you have the data in front of you and you can make clear treatment choices that they are always extremely happy and amazed of how quickly they get better. A lot of them love to do follow-up testing as well because they can actually see the changes and it just really emphasizes it for them, like how much they've come within their journey in getting healthier. So I'll probably run it about 80% of the time. Fantastic test to run with really complex cases where you really don't know where to start. So I think it's something that I think more and more practitioners will start to use as they get more comfortable with the test. I find that it's only been in the last year or so that practitioners have really got a new interest in organic acid testing, and a lot of them are very enthusiastic in learning more about it and understanding it better. So I think this is going to become bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on, and more and more practitioners will be using this as a first screening kind of a test with their clients. So in the next five years or so, I think this test is just going to become really, really huge. And I find that a lot of people, a lot of my clients actually want to learn more about the test as well. So I think what we're going to start getting is that drive of where people know more than their doctors about the test, And hopefully that's going to encourage a lot of doctors to start learning more about the test as well.
Right. And one of the benefits is there's more practitioners. I know you just came back from, and we appreciate you coming on. You 30-hour flight home, right, from teaching in England. And I know you taught a course in Australia. And so you're working, I think, a little bit with Great Plains, right, to do some teaching and educating docs about the test, which I think is great. And I think it's one of the things to get that test out there and used more. We got to teach people how to really use the test. And I know even when I've taught the course, I'm surprised sometimes at just the lack of understanding people have on the test. Some really, really smart people just don't understand the depths of it. And it's just because nobody's really tying all those pieces together. The labs do the test, but I think they could do an even better job, like hiring people like you to come out and teach it from a doctor's perspective, how to really utilize the test. I think that'll make a big difference in the test becoming more utilized on a regular basis. Absolutely. Erica, any final points?
No, I appreciate you coming on here, explaining the test, because it is an important test that a lot of practitioners or even, potential patients or even people who are struggling with their health may not even realize is an option. People know a regular standard blood test. They know maybe a stool sample. They know, maybe hormone testing, but this is something totally different that they may not understand or even realize is out there that could potentially really help them.
Absolutely. So can you give us some background of where people can find you if they're saying, hey, I'd really like to work with Dr. Lambert? Where can they get your information? Where can they find out more information about you?
Yeah, absolutely. I do a lot of Skype consultations. I've got 2 clinics within Australia that I work from. So I work with people all over the world, and they can get hold of me on my website, which is mthfrandbeyond.com.au. That would be one place that they could get hold of me. They can also get hold of me on our clinic, which is the realizehealth.com.au website as well. But probably the easiest would be just to contact my office at mthfrandbeyond.com.au and get in touch with me that way. And absolutely always happy to work with people all over the world, both practitioners and clients as well. So,
well, we appreciate you being on. There's a lot of great information back and forth. We could have spent another hour easily geeking on it, but I think we might have lost some people if we got too in depth on acids. There was many times I had to catch myself going, okay, but let's talk about I stopped myself and held back a little bit. So we'll wrap it up. Dr. Erica, why don't you reinforce where you're at so people know how to get a hold of you?
You can find me at brainandbodyhealthcenter.com. We have a Facebook page. You can find us at Doctors Riggleman on Instagram, and you can find us on YouTube as well. We have lots of videos. And when I say we, I mean me and my better half. My husband is also a doctor as well. That's where we help people with chronic issues in our office. So you can find lots of information on those different sources of media, and you can also get a hold of us that way.
Great. And my office is chronicconditionrecovery.com. I have the Thyroid Answers or Thyroid Problems Doctor website. And if you go to YouTube and type in thyroid stuff, you'll find me all over YouTube with videos, and same with Vimeo. So we thank Dr. Lambert for joining us for this episode of Thyroid Answers Podcast. If you're enjoying the Thyroid Answers Podcast, please go to iTunes and put in what am I looking for? What's the word I'm looking for?
A review?
A review, a positive review on the show. Perfect. That's what we need. See? So if you put in a positive review, that helps us with our rankings on iTunes. But once again, we hope you're getting good information from the podcast. Keep sending questions if you have them to wherever you're watching the Thyroid Answers Podcast, and we'll be sure to get back to you. That's it for this episode. We'll see you guys in the future.
Yeah. Great talking.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Yep. Thanks for coming.